Welcome to another segment of my session. I'm delighted to have in my midst Dr. Corbin. This is my first time, well, my second time meeting him, and it's such a pleasure. I want to give a special thank you to Honorable Wendell Swan for the introduction. Today, this topic is really an educational topic for me and for my viewers on independence. But before we go there, I'd like for Dr. Corbin to introduce himself to the viewers. Dr. Corbin, welcome to my YouTube session.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion. I am from the Virgin Islands, St. Croix, Virgin Islands. Was formerly the Minister of State for External Affairs. During that period is when I had the honor to work with Honorable Wendell Swan. So I was very much known about the Turks and Caicos Islands for a number of years, probably going back into the 1980s and onward. I was just, as we had our discussion earlier, I remember that the time I spent as an advisor for UNDP, United Nations Development Program, when the visiting mission took place from the United Nations to the Turks and Caicos Islands, and that was in 2005, which was a very interesting time period in the history of Turks and Caicos. My work takes me, since leaving government, actually, my work takes me to other territories in the Caribbean as well as in the Pacific. So I deal with the Dutch administered territories, the French administered territories, the US, as well as the British. All of these large countries administered territories in both regions of the world. And at least in the case of the Dutch, they no longer do, but the rest do. And we're looking at the issues of governance, issues of self-determination, and really focusing on the Charter of the United Nations in terms of fulfilling the mandate for self-determination for the remaining territories in the world. As you may know, there are like 17 remaining formally, although there are others, probably at least that many, that are not formally on the United Nations list, but yet to have achieved a full measure of self-government. And I think we see that in the Caribbean in a number of instances. So generally, that's what I do. I work on examining the level of self-government in these territories, but also probably more importantly for territories that are on the United Nations list, it's more to do with the question of their preparation for moving toward the full measure of self-government. I think this is a mandate of the General Assembly. This is a mandate of the United Nations Charter in Article 73B, requires countries that administer territories to advance these territories to the full measure of self-government. So the level that we are at in many ways is in effect a preparatory phase. And I know that there's often the case that it is being projected as a phase of end phase, if you will, that this is the end result of what will take place. However, it is really a question of it being a preparatory phase. So essentially, that's some of the things that I work on. I do self-governance assessments for various territories around, mainly in the Caribbean and Pacific, around those issues.
All right. So, Dr. Corbin, how does colonies prepare themselves to become decolonized? Well, what is the process of the preparation?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with education, awareness. It's a very interesting issue that the United Nations has a very extensive mandate and has made recommendations with respect to territories on their list. Each year, there's what's called a working paper that's prepared of the developments that take place annually. And also there's a hearing process for each territory on the list, which um, takes place in June. Prior to that, there's a seminar, a regional seminar, which also focuses intently on the developments in the territory, and what has happened, and what activities are underway to bring the territories to full self-government. And then, of course, you have at the end of the year, in October, the fourth committee of the General Assembly meets, examines the territories individually, and then ultimately in December, the General Assembly adopts resolutions with recommendations on how to advance the territories forward. Now, of course, depending on the individual territory concerned, you don't necessarily have a great deal of awareness of how this process actually works. Some territories have been much more involved than others, and some territories have advanced in that process. But when governments change, invariably, sometimes that process ends or begins, depending on what happened in the previous government. We find that to be the case, certainly in our own government. So the key, I think, is education, awareness, recognizing the options. I mean, the issue of self-determination, and which is a process leading to, as in what the UN Charter refers to as a full measure of self-government. And what does that actually mean? Well, that means independence. It also means integration, and in the category in the middle is the free association. And these are the three options that are recognized as providing the full measure of self-government. And this is categorized in Resolution 1541 of 1960, which is the current resolution that provides the minimum standards for self-government. So if in fact those are the three minimum standards, then what we experience in the territories today can only be that of preparatory or preparation, because in fact we have not reached that level. So the issue is to, on the one hand, understanding that we are in that preparatory phase and we have not reached the end result yet. And then secondly, understanding the options and being able to devise models for ourselves, because no two options are the same, no two models are the same, in the world. So it's really about education, I think, yes. Awareness raising and so on.
Yes. Dr. Corbin, speaking about education, so what are the benefits then of becoming an independent nation? Because there are a lot of people who have a lot of fear of becoming independent. They look at some countries that are independent and are struggling, and they feel that the dependent territories are better off in the state they're in now. So what are the benefits?
Well, I'm asked that question from time to time. And I always must refer to the former leader of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, father of the country, who essentially wrote in his book, Man in Development, that it is better to govern or misgovern yourself than to be governed by anybody else. It's a very interesting quote, given all that has happened with us in the Caribbean over time. But I mean, there's always negative examples to point to, but as many negative examples as there are also positive examples, and why we don't point to those is depending on where you sit on the scheme of things, because in the end, this is a political process. So if one of the problems and the downside of politics is that there's a tendency to denigrate the other side, or the group or the organization or the individual that takes a different position, or the position that they're taking. You denigrate that position rather than promote your own position on the positive side. Right? So that's part of this whole idea of, well, there might be a negative situation. You might turn into, a very difficult particularly economic and social situation overnight. I mean, it's really some of the things that I hear on that are pretty difficult. But I think what this also looks at is the question of the current status, right? So, your current status was never meant to be permanent. Okay, it was always meant to be transitional to something permanent. But if you show where one status, particularly independence, is something which is seen as difficult, then the tendency is to, and not being aware that there are other status options as well, right? So then you have a problem with recognizing and moving forward, and there's some fear and there's some anxiety individually, etc. I mean, one of the things that we talk about, and I'm not necessarily a proponent of any of the three options, but I do say that in terms of independence, it's far easier for a small country to be independent in the 21st century than it was in the past. And that is because of no country at this point is fully independent. There's more interdependence that goes on. So depending on your geographic location, depending on your language, your various connections one makes. Turks and Caicos Islands, for example, is associate member of CARICOM, so that provides its own dynamic of having links with other countries in the region, which have various areas that could continue and expand. There are other links geographically. You're closest to, in the southern part of the Bahamas. That link is historic. It's cultural. It's family ties. It's also, economic. Right. So you're not going to operate. You would not operate fully, independent of the world, isolated from the rest of the world. It's not. That's not how the world works anymore. So it's really a question of recognizing how one can maximize their opportunities. And there are many examples of small states in the Caribbean and elsewhere that do quite well, and they have less resources, fewer resources than others, but they have invested in their people. All right, there's an investment in terms of their educational component, the technical skills, the digital world, the idea that we have some very brilliant young people, and they're all over the world, and many of them would love to be able to contribute to the development of their country. And I think that to tap that is something that is very real, and something that I believe would enhance our own self-esteem in terms of what we think we can do on our own. And again, it's not on our own. It's really with respect to our links, ties, relations with our neighbors, with the global community, through the United Nations, through other institutions that would assist in the economic and social development of the territory, which would, if in fact the territory proceeds to the next level.
Got it. I mean, and like you say, it's just political independence. We'll be interdependent. So it's not really, we'll not be fully independent. You'll have political independence from the UK if you're a UK territory, but you'll still be dependent, financial in other areas. Because I brought this up because there is a lot of concern by persons saying, oh, we can't get independent. We don't produce our own food. We still importing a lot of stuff. There's a lot of that kind of talk that we shouldn't become independent because we're still relying on other countries for importation of food. What do you say about that?
Well, I mean, there are many countries in the world that don't produce their own food. They have other assets. They have other modes of production within their society. Many, in fact, are involved in the digital world. So you have situations where, again, it's not a matter of being continuing to be economically dependent, but rather becoming economically interdependent.
Right.
Okay, some countries are focused on one thing, and they're able to exchange what they have. Those of our in the Caribbean, many of our countries are tourism economies. I think Turks and Caicos Islands is one of them,
Yes.
and has obviously, in fact, one of the most beautiful places in the world I've ever seen is
Thank you.
Grand Turk.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, yeah, I mean that's no doubt, and that goes back a very long time. Um, and so I used to go hide there actually when I was in government, just to get away from the fray, political fray,
Mm,
and it was always a great experience. The question of interdependence, I think, is really a key. Small states throughout the world, um, no one can produce. No one is totally self-sufficient in anything. All
mhm,
right, so you rely on your contacts, on your economic ties, on your political ties to develop, these kinds of things. I mean, even if we're looking at the COVID situation today, we find that our dependency is often because of our political links,
mhm.
that provide, on the one hand, support, but on the other hand restricts support from elsewhere. So these kinds of things are not just with COVID, but for other things as well. So the idea of the kind of relationship that exists in an independent, or even in a free, I look at free association also as an important option that I feel does need to be revisited, if you will, particularly to placate those who have some hesitation about independence. But um, the question is really a matter of recognizing that it's an opportunity to examine that independence, indeed, or any other option, is about political equality, and our arrangements, generally speaking, dependent territories are in fact examples of political inequality, and I think that and there are some implications to such inequality that we suffer every day.
Yes. Yes. Now, you mentioned earlier about some smaller nations, and you mentioned how they've invested in their people. From your point of view, what are the minimum requirements a country should have in place once they become politically independent? Because there are many concerns that, for example, the Turks and Caicos Islands, we don't have some of our own people in key positions. Should that matter? I mean, to become political independent, or what should be some of the minimum requirements?
Well, I'm not certain as to what minimum requirements exist. I think I go back to the Charter of the United Nations, particularly, again, Article 73B. And this is a mandate of the Charter, which is probably, if arguably, the most important uh, multilateral agreement treaty there is. And Article 73B essentially says that countries that administer territories are supposed to prepare those territories for self-government. Now, um, the question, therefore, is, the whole issue of human resource development. And then I mentioned earlier about, you know, bringing education, technical expertise to be developed within the society. This comes from there are a number of ways to do that. I mean, in some cases, several other territories that I'm aware of in the Caribbean, have a policy whereby if there's something, a particular technical requirement, and there's no one internally to actually do that, then someone may be brought in for that purpose. But they also have to have an understudy, from a local understudy, right? Which then that person may serve 1 year, 2 years, whatever, may serve a third year as a consultant, whatever, later on. But the idea is to train local expertise.
Right.
And surprisingly, there could very well may be persons in the diaspora who have that expertise, who are
True.
working somewhere else, who
True.
might wish to return home. You also have persons who may not have to return home because of the digital world. You can do what it is you're doing from wherever you are. So there are a lot of different possibilities here. But it should, the idea of relying on others for technical support or expertise, I think is something that is not a major, should not be a major
Okay.
consideration at this point.
Okay. Now you mentioned Article 73B, whereby, the country should be prepared. Now, we've been a territory of the UK for years, but I don't think they are preparing us to become independent. I don't see any preparation by the UK. And when I read some articles where a lot of the independent territories say that they were not prepared. No one prepared them, and I don't think we have been prepared.
Well, that's probably true. And in fact, the idea is whether or not the current situation is regarded as being in a preparatory phase. Now, my suggestion is that is what it is supposed to be. But in effect, what I think is happening is that we refer to it in dependency governance studies as dependency legitimization.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that there's a process by which the dependency status is portrayed as the status of good governance and a status of equality, whereas in effect it's not. And I think what often happens under this situation is that there's something also referred to as dependency accommodation, where often is the case that though many of us make an accommodation with it, and then we internalize the inequality and see it as something which is legitimate, when in effect it does not meet necessarily the standards of full self-government. So when you have, for example, veto powers over laws and various things of that nature, which are unilateral authority which exists, then that's difficult to argue that these are options of political equality. They're really options of they're in the preparatory phase, and all the while that this phase goes on are the things we earlier talked about in terms of bringing people, training, expertise, etc. All this is supposed to be ongoing during that preparatory phase. So that, and you mentioned other countries in the region, which we're not prepared, and that is absolutely correct. And I think that what has happened is that there was a lag in their development because of that. And in the beginning, they were thrust into a situation without having been fully prepared, because during the colonial period of those countries, there was the whole issue of human resource development and even infrastructure development had not been properly done. So all of that was then thrust upon these newly independent countries. One of the things that we can look at in the Caribbean is that the last country to become independent was St. Kitts and Nevis, and that was 1983.
Okay.
So that makes for a very difficult period. If there was a long period of time between then and now.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has occurred during that period has been particularly sense of dormancy, okay, and on the part of moving forward. And I think this has been a tragedy in my mind, in the sense that you don't have this awareness of the current arrangement as it relates to other potential options you may have in the future. But in terms of going back to the infrastructure question, I think many of the island territories have had opportunity to develop and build their infrastructure, so to some degree, uh, the territories are better prepared to take another step on the basis of some elements, but not other elements. And I think
Right.
part of that is just over time, from that period of time. There are there are three periods of this. I think if you look at the beginning of the United Nations, was really the genesis of the discussion about what to do with territories having been acquired over time by various countries from Europe, mainly in the Pacific and the Caribbean, for the purposes of, you know, pillaging and all of that, and gaining access, gaining um, the geostrategicness of it, and this goes back, centuries. But in the end, what you end up with is, at the UN, the end of World War II, the United Nations was formed, and one of the main features of this was what to do with these territories that were acquired. So that period, 1945, 1946 was the first list of territories that were put on the list by the various countries that had territories: the British, the French, the Dutch, the US, and so on, the Portuguese, right? So by 1960, between 46 and 1960, you had trying to determine, there was a determination, discussion of the determination of how to bring the territories to self-government. And so you began at the beginnings of the stages of trying to define what is constituted self-government. By 1960, you had the Decolonization Declaration and its companion resolution 1541, which identified the three options of independence, free association, and integration. From that point on, you essentially created what we refer to as the decolonization acceleration period, where many countries became self-governing as a result of the decisions that the UN took in 1960, those two resolutions that I referred to. So many countries in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, and Africa became independent, or freely associated or integrated during that period. But of course, at the end of and it essentially went for like a 30-year period. In 1990, a number of things happened. One, in Namibia became independent. That was the very last large territory to become independent, and there was a recognition that there was the rest of, mainly most of the territories remaining were small islands.
Yeah.
And then and which of course were projected at that point as not having expressed an interest in independence, and not having necessarily the resources in order to do that. So that argument really began to take shape at that time. And then, of course, another situation occurred at the same time, and that was the end of the Cold War. And then the countries that had territories began to argue at the United Nations that the territories that the Cold War, that decolonization was a Cold War issue, and therefore, since the Cold War was over, then decolonization should begin to fade away. And this was the position that was taken, and you saw a stiffening of approach in terms of promoting the self-government and promoting changes. And this is where I believe the dependency accommodation and the dependency legitimization arguments began to take shape. And this is essentially where we are today.
Right. So size really doesn't matter then, right? I mean, I know you mentioned most of the islands, most of the countries that remain decolonized, most of the countries that remain dependent, they are small islands. But the size shouldn't matter, really, does it?
I mean, there are many small island countries in the world, uh, as few as 10,000 people. I mean, it's really a matter of the links that are made. Once again, it really does go back to the question of interdependence.
Mm-hmm.
And if and I mean, we have so many different variations in our territories. For example, we have in Turks and Caicos Islands, as in the, the Virgin Islands, both the British Virgin Islands and U.S. Virgin Islands. We are multi-island jurisdictions,
Yes.
which has its own dynamic. There's some territories is just one island. Some countries it's just one island. Does that make it easier, or does it make it more difficult, or does it allow you to innovate? There are different. There are a lot of different issues here, different areas. We have some people who are examining these things, but the main point is that we need to be able to interact. We need to be able to trade
Mm-hmm.
without issues of someone telling us who we can talk to, who we can't talk to, who we can trade with, who we can't.
That's
You
it.
know,
That's it.
your geography is such that you have links. The potential links you have with various countries in the world is just amazing. And so there are a lot of opportunities. But again, it really does take a matter of raising awareness,
Yeah.
and also looking at the next steps and the possibilities. And once again, I am not advocating any particular option, but I know I am saying that the current status of our territories generally is it needs to take a level. There needs to be a level above that. There needs to be a step needs to be taken. This is again the preparatory phase, which is a phase that needs to be completed.
Yeah. Dr. Corbin, in 1976, in the Turks and Caicos Islands, we started the ministerial form of government, and we had our first chief minister, the Honorable Jakes McCartney. Unfortunately, he died in a plane crash in 1980. But prior to that plane crash, he was on the verge of making the Turks and Caicos Islands an independent country. In fact, the agreement was already basically drawn up, and I think the UK had agreed to, I think, $30 million, something like that. And so this is back in 1980 or 1979. And if Jackson died in that plane crash, we might have been an independent nation from then.
Well, I mean, it's again. I was looking over a paper I wrote last in 2014 when examining the political evolution of Turks and Caicos, and it's interesting that the situation has changed in the terms of the interest in moving and progressing territories to full self-government, and that changed to looking at trying to maintain territories and convincing the territory that it's better off the way it is. Now, part of that has to do with geostrategic positioning. Certainly, part of it has to do with its influence and what have you. In some cases, in the Caribbean, you will find part of it has to do with having enclaves where persons can go, and from Europe to go to another part to the Caribbean because the weather is favorable, etc. So you have a lot of the reasoning, and of course now we have the world is much smaller,
Yes.
and so it's easier to get from point A to point B, and it's easier to get from, say, Miami to Turks and Caicos than it is to get from Miami to California. I mean, in terms of the distance. So you've got a lot of that dynamic going on as well. But I think really the issue of trying to put the history of Turks and Caicos was, as you had suggested, during that period. If you look at as it goes further into the, as we proceed up to the present day, you'll find there have been advances and then perhaps one or two steps backward, right? I think I was in looking at the document last night. It reminded me of the name of it, recolonization of the colony, right? The colony. There was I think constitutional order that was then reversed. And then was another constitutional order, and then that one was reversed. And in other words, the areas of autonomy that were given were then taken back for various reasons. And so the question is, well, at what point does that capacity of unilateral authority, at what point does that end, or is that going to be the continuous process? Because in effect, we talk about the issue of political equality, and it's if you have a mutual consent arrangement where one cannot legislate for the other without their consent, then that's what is recognized as one element of one option of a full measure of self-government. Whereas if you maintain a scenario where someone can decide to unilaterally as to what decisions are taken, or whether or not, in the case I think I read in Bermuda recently, where the issue of the cannabis industry was being discussed, and the parliament adopted cannabis legislation, and I think the British governor indicated they were not willing to sign it. I think that's also something, that discussion that's going on in the British Virgin Islands today regarding the cannabis legislation. So, I mean, the idea that if the elected government, this is what articulated by the Bermuda premier, that if in fact the elected government adopts a legislation, then it should be considered to be law. But yet at the same time, there's this position, the authority to prevent it from being law. So the question is, in these points, some would argue, well, that's a way of modifying, or it's a way of overseeing the situation. Others would argue that, in effect, is something which should be phased out. So I mean, these are the kinds of real activities, because obviously that particular industry is something that is on the upswing, and could very well be a major contributor to the GDP of countries who are strategically positioned to engage in that industry in many aspects of that industry. So I'm not an advocate necessarily of it, but it's saying that the issue of unilateral power, I think, is really the point. And of course, now you're also seeing some references into the possibility of modifying the arrangement, whereby there could be some representation in London, or in the case similar to what exists in the context of U.S. territories, where they'd have some sort of delegate status, non-voting delegate status, something along those lines has been discussed, as well as persons coming from London or from the UK, or in fact similar to the US, where they would come in and have voting rights and rights to run for elections and so on. So all this is being discussed as well. So status quo, remaining in the status quo, does not really mean that you are remaining the same. It means that things are being contemplated for change, but it's not. But you're not necessarily involved in that decision.
Right. Dr. Corbin, there's been a lot of frustration in the Turks and Caicos from some people. We had a great 2006 constitution where the ministers had a lot of flexibility. And then in 2008, there was a call for a commission inquiry into alleged corruption and dishonesty. And that constitution was taken away from us. We have a constitution, but the powers of the ministers in government have been reduced. In fact, you have the permanent secretaries who report, who don't report to the ministers. And some people in the country feel that they're running the country, not the elected members. You have a cabinet in which the governor chairs the cabinet, and there must be a consensus among everybody in the cabinet before, in order for a bill to go to the House. And so there's a lot of frustration. And further frustration is that we have this case that's been going on since, in 2008, the commission inquiry started. It ended in 2009. And then the case started in 2010, and we are in 2021. And we've spent almost $90 million on that case. And so there's a lot of frustration. And so some people now are saying, we need to get independent. So sometimes it's like certain things have to happen in the country for us to call for independence. And I don't think we should wait until things happen. We should always have an education process to the public on the process of education. So there are some people who really want to become independent, and there are others who don't want to.
Yeah, well, that's the situation in a lot of territories. If you look at some countries that are now independent in the Caribbean, you will find that during the time of independence, there was there was not universal. In fact, in some cases, a particular political party. One case, there was a political party that was against independence, but after independence, they became the government. So it's always going to be a discussion. Yes. But I think it's really a question of looking at, understanding the current arrangement is really where I think we need to focus some attention on. Generally speaking, this is the case in all of the islands. I just completed a self-governance assessment for Bonaire, which is one of the territories of the Netherlands, and in fact, its relationship was projected as being integrated, but in reality, they don't have any voting rights. They have voting rights, but their numbers are so small that they have no representation in the Netherlands. So there's an issue of partial integration, and we have to look at that. Now, I think if we're looking at the elements of integration, the main point is that in the case of Bonaire, they are in a position of not having the full rights in the system, and they also don't have the full authority to make their own decisions. In many ways, we look at the other territories that are on the United Nations list, and we are all, those of us in the Caribbean, 7 of us in the Caribbean, plus Puerto Rico, which is partially on the list, if you will, because they're only addressed in the committee, and not the full General Assembly. But the issue is what is the arrangement, the governance arrangement? Who has the final authority? Is there the capacity to, or the authority to legislate for the territories without their consent, and in many cases against their will? And you will find, if you apply that question to all of the arrangements, you will see where this is something that is a democratic deficit. Yeah. And this deficit needs to be addressed in order for us to move it forward. It can be addressed by full integration, where you have full political rights. In the case, if you take the U.S. as an example, you have elements in Puerto Rico that want to become the 51st state of Puerto Rico. The current government of Puerto Rico supports that. That's what they've been advocating for many years. They would have full rights. Whereas you also have the independence option, which also in the case of Puerto Rico, you have elements in Puerto Rico that support independence, and you have also those who support free association.
Yes.
And I think that you have ability to have this dialogue in the society to determine the best approach.
Yeah.
But I think in order before we get to that point, we have to recognize where we are,
Mhm.
and I think often we don't have enough discussion about that.
No, we don't.
Where are we? What are we, and why is it? There's a lot of questions about why. And so if we really examine it, and this is essentially what I've been doing over the years, is looking at these arrangements through the lens of the self-governance indicators. Okay, we have indicators that have been created for the purpose of examining each of the models of the dependency models to determine the level of not only the level of self-government, but also again
Mhm.
uh, the level of preparation to self-government. We have a acronym PSG, preparation for self-government. To what degree uh, our territories prepared?
Right.
And in some cases, the territories are prepared well in some areas and not in other areas. But
Mhm.
one of the key issues is the transfer of power. And this is an element, again, coming out of the United Nations, the Decolonization Declaration of 1514 in 1960 refers to the question of transfer of power.
Mhm.
Okay, there must be a transfer of power, otherwise it's really not a change. We can change the name,
Yeah.
which we've done. I think I think Puerto Rico went from territory to Commonwealth, so the name was changed.
Yeah.
I think the British territories went from dependent territories to overseas territories.
Yeah.
But the question is whether or not the change of name also changed the, the asymmetrical power
Mhm.
relationship,
Yeah.
and probably no,
Mhm.
probably not. But I think and of course, there are a number of reasons why
Yeah.
that have been
Right.
projected as why not. But in any case, that's where we are today.
Yeah. Now, for the independent countries, when there is alleged corruption, because in Turks and Caicos, what happened was the British came in and ran the country from 2009 to 2012. For
Right.
those countries that are independent, when there is an alleged corruption and there's a commission of inquiry, what I know it depends on the country, but what normally happens when you have allegations of corruption and there's a commission of inquiry? Because in Turks and Caicos, the British came in, and some people like that because they felt if we were independent, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, but I know in other countries there are cases of corruption. There was commission of inquiry, but so what normally happens?
Well, it really it depends on a number of factors. I mean, if it could be something created internally,
Hmm.
the judiciary, which is usually independent of politics, would, if in effect, could be tasked to do something. There could also be external requests for assistance in
Okay.
this regard. So there are different ways to do this. I do remember the commission of inquiry that started at that time in Turks and Caicos, and I think if there's a report that needs to be referred to in many respects, and that was the CARICOM visiting mission to Turks and Caicos to examine. They made some very interesting recommendations on how Turks and Caicos could move forward politically and constitutionally.
Oh,
I'm not certain as to what the status of those recommendations is, but
mhm.
certainly the issue was looked at very carefully.
Got it.
And the question, of course, is how do you address issues of governance, right? And I think this is part of the maturity of a society.
Yes.
I like to use Barbados as an example. I'm a Barbadian. My father's from Barbados, so
Oh, okay.
I claim Barbados as well.
All right.
And and it's one of the most well run countries in the world, okay, in
Mhm.
terms of governance. Right.
Mhm.
So they were formerly a colony. They became independent, and they have political party. They have one of the most dynamic prime ministers globally at this point.
Yes.
The idea is that with with independence comes a maturation process. It comes through a maturation process,
Got it.
political maturation. That's the preparatory phase. So when you get to that level, if you have an issue, then you have mechanisms, institutions in place to to deal with that. And if you need external assistance, then that's you have the capacity and the ability to bring that assistance to bear if you wish
Awesome.
that to be the case. So
Awesome.
these are some of the issues. Yeah.
Yeah. Dr. Corbin, many years ago, the UK allowed the dependent territories, overseas territories, to be able to migrate to the UK. They could work, they could live there, and they could go to school. And as a result of that policy, many Turks and Caicos Islanders have migrated to United Kingdom. They got the British passports. They are in school. Their children are attending elementary, secondary school. Some of them are working. And so they see this benefit of being a colony of the UK where they could go to United Kingdom to study, to live and work. And so, and we have, it's believed that there's about 3,000 Turks and Caicos Islanders living in the United Kingdom, and we don't have much. Our population is very small. We have about a population of 40,000 and about, 12,000 are Turks and Caicos Islanders. And so even convincing those people to talk about independence or consider independence will be a challenge because they see it as a benefit, the opportunity to live, migrate, to study and work in United Kingdom without any immigration issues.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge.
Well, it's the current scenario. One could question whether that would change and if you move to another or self-governing status. Part of the arrangement of self-government is your relations with other countries, and in fact, depending, that could be something which could be negotiated to maintain that kind of a link.
Okay.
You have no doubt, undoubtedly, an independent Turks and Caicos Islands would be a member of the Commonwealth. Now, if a Commonwealth group of countries. Now, right now, as a result of Brexit, the Commonwealth group is now becoming far more important to the UK, and because it's now a question of, if you read some of the documents that are now coming out on Global Britain and so on, you will see the importance of the Commonwealth being considered. So, as a member of the Commonwealth, it's very well may be that there could be comparable kinds of arrangements. We don't know.
That's a good point.
We'd have to look at it. But I mean, these things are. I don't think it's an either or situation. I think it's if you have. And it's really a question of the power of negotiation. You sit down and say, okay, you negotiate a maintenance of certain arrangements. As an example, I can give you an example unrelated, but it gives you some indication of how it would work. In the Pacific, you have territories that were formerly under the UN trusteeship, particularly Federated States of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, and Palau, those three. were formerly under the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. And they, during the Trust Territory period, they had access to U.S. Programs, technical programs, economic programs, etc. And when they negotiated their free association arrangement, which became also allowed them to join the United Nations as a full member with a compact of free association with the United States, they were able to maintain access to many of those programs. So in effect, and we take it to present day in the COVID scenario, many of those countries have access to the U.S. COVID vaccination program as a result of the links that they were able to maintain in the transition to the new status. But because of the historic ties and links that they had with the United States, they were able to maintain that. But it came through the negotiation process. And I wouldn't say that would necessarily be the case, but I think it's a good model to consider.
Yeah.
That in fact, when there's a transition to something, it doesn't necessarily mean that everything breaks off. Ties break, the historic links, economic ties, all of that. It doesn't mean that ends. It
Everything
means,
ends. Got it.
And this is one of the things that is often used as a means of saying, well, if we move to another level, then everything will end, and we were breaking ties, etc. These kinds of phrases are used, but in reality, it's a transition to another level. But the ties that have been created over time, it's unrealistic to think that they would break and be broken. They would certainly be modified, but that's part of the maturation process of any society.
That's a good point you raise. It's all about negotiation. And speaking about negotiation, I mentioned earlier how our first Chief Minister, the Right Honorable J.X. McCartney, he was negotiating a price, I think, about $13 million. I can't stand to be corrected. But based on your experience, when countries become decolonized, do those parent countries pay them some lump sum or something? Is that part of the process or not necessarily?
I can't say that that's part of it. I think what happens is that there is a very intense negotiation resulting in, and there's economic aspects of it, elements of it, and there may be transfer of resources. There may be a wide range of areas, trade preferences, things, various things that would come in the sense of that. So, it's really also a question of to what degree does the larger country regard the importance of maintaining that kind of link with the territory as well. So there are various aspects to this.
Yeah. Now, do you think if a government didn't campaign on independence on their platform, and then when they become government, they decided they want to become independent, do you think they'll have to have a referendum?
Well, I remember I was advisor to the Bermuda Independence Commission back in, I guess it was 2005, somewhere in there. And there was this question of referendum versus political, what you were referring to as the political party platform having independence in the platform. Up to a certain point, I recall that either of those two were considered to be valid.
Okay.
But at that point, it appeared to be that referendum was beginning to take precedence, at least as far as the recognition of the requirement to move to another level. In Bermuda, I recall that you remember that there was a referendum on independence at some point.
Yes.
And it was interesting that the party in power that held the referendum was not in favor of independence, but the premier was in favor of independence
Oh,
of that party, as I
okay.
recall. And of course, it did not. The independence did not prevail, but caused the fall of the government, all that. But the issue is, yeah, in fact, these are the method that seems to be in play now
Right.
is referenda, as a referendum. I'm not to say that that should be the case or is not the case, but it was at one point in time where if a political party was in power and their platform had independence and they won the election, then it is recognized that the people have voted in favor of
Yeah.
independence.
Yes.
But I
Yes.
don't think that that is a prevailing view at this point, at
Yes.
least on the part of the country that would have to facilitate
Yes.
the independence of the former territory.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Corbin, I just want to thank you for this opportunity. This is, I'm quite sure we'll have to have more conversations about this, and I appreciate this opportunity. But before we close, do you have anything else you want to add that perhaps we have not covered? You could do that, please.
I think you've covered everything.
Oh, okay.
No, I just thank you, for having a conversation with this. I think it's important that, again, we look at where we are and understand where we are so that we can make conscious and informed decisions as to where we need to go.
Mhm.
And part of what you do is clearly to heighten that awareness and bring that conversation, try to dispel rumors and try to minimize the emotion about
Mhm.
it, and try to look at it from a clearly perspective of the future of the territory, what you would like to see, what the people want, and eventually you would have a more informed
Mhm.
view, and
Yes.
in effect, in one of the things that is very very critical again is to understand the current arrangement and how that shapes up in terms of arrangements throughout the world.
Mhm.
What is the power? What is the political power relationship existing? What is meant by self-government? Is where are the deficits existing in the arrangement? Can those be alleviated, or in fact, are there other options that need to be examined and explored? And all these things I think would be useful to look at. And I think certainly Turks and Caicos Islands has had a very uh, successful run. It has had some extraordinary leaders. It has had some very important scholars and thinkers, and the younger generation coming up, both in the territory and in the diaspora, can all contribute to this kind of overall discussion, and make conscious decisions on the way forward.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, and it's a pleasure having you on this show. It's been very informative, educational for not only me, I'm quite sure the viewers. And I look forward to having another discussion with you in the future. Thanks again.
Well, my pleasure. Have a good day.
You too.
Take care.
All right.